Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm a clinical social worker from Minnesota. I've worked the majority of my career in intensive care units here in the Twin Cities area. I'm now an adjunct professor at a local university and sit on a board for a nonprofit whose initiatives lie in promoting clear water and pure water across our great state here in Minnesota. A couple years ago, I became the lead community organizer to protect a wetland, literally in my backyard. In this video, I detail the redevelopment process. I describe how power, policy, and politics intersect, and how social workers really are in a unique position to advocate for change. So, thank you so much for joining me as we tell this story of this wetland tale. It was a couple years ago when I received a small yellow postcard in the mail informing me that a redevelopment proposal would be coming to the City Planning Commission that may have some impact on my residents. I nonchalantly threw it up on the counter and continued on my day with two small children trotting behind me like little ducklings emerging in our pond. My husband and I had just moved our family to an area we had no connection to, and my entire energy was dedicated to making sure our house felt like a home. My family had lived in St. Paul for generations. My mom grew up in McAllister Groveland on Juliet Street, a quaint neighborhood where everyone on her block pledged allegiance to the city that was ingrained in their very being. We traded in our urban life on Carroll Avenue to move to the quote unquote suburbs, a place I truly thought I would never call home. In my heart, I knew it
So
was the
we are at
ducks and the faint
816
calls of
Carroll
trumpeter
Avenue,
swans in the wetland
which is
behind my
in
home
the
that drew
Summit
me to this
University
magical
area
place.
of St. Paul.
During the redevelopment process I am about to detail, our wetland was referred to as a wasteland and a swamp. In these moments, I closed my eyes and imagined the trumpeter swans and sandhill cranes calling out in perfect unison, as if to cry out in protest. Henry David Thoreau, a philosopher and naturalist, is often affectionately named the patron saint of swamps for his self proclaimed love of these sacred places. As he detailed in a previous writing, I seem to have reached a new world, so wild a place, so far from human society. What's the need of visiting far off mountains and bogs if a half hour's walk will carry me into such wilderness and novelty? And so begins this wetland tale, a tale of power, politics, regulation, corporate responsibility, and community advocacy. Through this format of case conceptualization, I will summarize the redevelopment efforts, neighborhood concerns, agency collusion, wetland conservation efforts, community organizing, psychosocial influences, and reflections on process through a social work lens. Almost immediately, I realized the implications this development would have on my property and wetland habitat. The site consisted of an older strip mall that the owner wanted to sell to a car dealership. There were several dealerships around this area, so I initially felt the development seemed appropriate. As I researched, I learned that the dealership wished to build a road from the main building to the parking lot behind. That area, however, was not quote unquote buildable land without getting variances and zoning changes from the city. All the other parking lots around the wetlands had berms and mature trees, so they were designed to try and be
Babe.
hidden in the landscape. There were no community engagement sessions scheduled to talk with the neighbors about this development project. There was also not an environmental assessment that would be completed prior to development, which was a concern to neighbors due to the wetland habitat that existed. The proposal seemed to start moving quickly through the bureaucratic process, so my husband and I followed it closely. He went to the first planning commission. they did not have enough votes to recommend the project to the city. Then it went to the city council. They wanted more information from the developer about the project before voting. In a surprise move, the city planning department also started to argue that there would be less of an environmental impact if the car dealership built a large parking garage instead of a surface level parking lot, and essentially requested the dealership to come back with a plan to build a large parking garage. In their speeches and neatly displayed narratives and drawings, the city planning staff assured the public that this would in fact be better for the environment and cited that the DNR was working closely with them on this and agreed. In my mind, things started to stop making sense. How could building a large parking garage that included piling construction, a very invasive form of building, be better for the environment? Up until this point, I had mainly been spreading the word about the redevelopment, making and handing out flyers to the neighbors, encouraging them to get involved. Now, to be fair, my motivations were not completely altruistic. Of course, I worried about the impact to the wetland habitat and felt strongly that it deserved an environmental assessment. I also had worries about how a large parking garage would now consume my view and impact my daily life and property value. Upon moving, we understood the wetland was protected by Federal Wetland Conservation Act, and that development encroaching in the wetland would be nearly impossible because of these protections in place. Now, at this point, my husband was emailing the city, speaking at the planning commission meetings, and asking questions. The neighbors wanted to be given an example of a corporation that was granted these variances and zoning permits in the area. We were not given an example. We were given a chart showing the light rail, a public use project, and a few homeowners who were granted a wetland variance. The city could not provide a single example in their history of a similar situation, and yet they continued to imply it was a standard situation to grant so many exemptions from following the rules. The city argued that the parking garage would not, quote unquote, change the character of the neighborhood, which was met by fierce opposition to neighbors. We were concerned about the parking garage having only one access point, a road. We asked about how the parking garage would be screened. We asked if it would be bermed. The site is not large enough for a berm, so we understood that was unlikely. I was in no way an expert on the development policies that governed this wetland, but I couldn't understand how all the other dealerships had to follow these screening and berming rules over several decades. And this dealership comes in and suddenly they have all the rules bent for them. I certainly sensed that there was a lot more going on in this wetland tale than met the eye. I needed to really ramp up my community organizing efforts.
And they are going to build five a five-story parking lot in the middle of the wetland.
Serhei Moscovici was a Romanian born social psychologist who is known for his research on minority influence. He argued that when a minority tries to change the opinion of the majority in some way, there are key components that will determine how successful the movement is: consistency, confidence, and appearing unbiased. If we think back to the progress and reform era of the 1900s through the 1930s, child labor was standard practice. Children were working long hours, 6 days a week, often in dangerous working conditions. There's this famous photo of a group of young boys who worked in a mine, and their young, exploited faces told a story of 1,000 words with a single image. Photography, in this case, was the catalyst that changed the public opinion of child labor in the United States. People were able to actually see the plight of these children through compelling images that were difficult to ignore. Advocacy efforts focused on consistency, confidence, and appearing unbiased, in tune with Moscovici's anthem for social change. This movement led to legislation that would finally protect children and claim responsibility for changing the prevailing public opinion on children in the workforce. I thought a lot about how I could tap into these themes to start my own advocacy campaign. So, to summarize, a car dealership wanted to buy a vacant strip mall and build a surface level parking lot in the back, but they would need a wetland variance and zoning permits to do this because a wetland buffer is federally protected area. The neighbors were concerned about how the development may impact the wetland. The developer was not offering to complete an environmental assessment. The city was not requesting the developer to do this. The developer initially wanted a surface level parking lot. Why would the city then ask them to come back with plans for a larger, more intrusive parking garage that neighbors would absolutely oppose? Neighbors understood all the other dealers around the wetland had their developments either bermed or screened. Why was this developer given a free pass? Because the site is not large enough to comply with the landscaping ordinances. Neighbors expressed concern that the road leading to the parking garage would be almost entirely surrounded by wetland. So if a fire broke out, it would be difficult to fight with limited access points and seemed like a potential of the fire to spread to the wetland and neighboring homes was likely. The dealer was also planning to put mainly electric vehicles out in the garage, which have been reported as starting on fire in numerous reports. The parking garage and surface lot developments both would not be in accordance with parking ratio metrics that were written into city ordinances. They would need to build indoor parking to meet that ordinance. The development did not have the landscaping screening in place to comply with I-394 ordinances. The city had one virtual online listening session for residents that happened after the first vote already took place. Our agenda item was consistently at the end of the evening in every meeting, and sometimes these city council meetings last for hours. Another attempt to suppress public comments. Other development projects had a lot of community engagement. The city had not been in support of a large church development and cited their concern over the encroachment of a wetland with nesting trumpeter swans. The city didn't care for this development likely because it was a church, and churches are exempted from property taxes. So the city really wasn't going to make money off of this. So they sided with the neighbors and cited their concerns with the nearby wetland. However, in our situation, they say the exact opposite, yet we have here the same concerns with the same environmental impact present. So the new proposal for a 5-story parking garage went to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission were tied in terms of them recommending the project to the City Council. The city attorney interpreted the policy, which declared in the instance of a tie, it would be a no in terms of recommendation. In the future, the city would misrepresent this vote and consistently say that there was not a recommendation made. And both times, the Planning Commission had recommended no for the development. So at this point, I really put on my community organizing hat and decided to take on this initiative. I knew that we had to make an impact and gather public support by the next council meeting when this would be heard again. I was feeling extremely frustrated with the city, who appeared to be pushing through this massive development at lightning speed without consideration to the habitat or neighbors. I focused my efforts in these ways. Number one, coalition building. I tried to surround myself with people who were much smarter than me on these issues. Through my neighborhood outreach and media posts on Nextdoor, I connected with local environmentalists, local nonprofits with shared missions to protect the environment, bird experts, environmental attorneys, etc. These connections were key in my advocacy efforts. The bird photographer offered to take professional photos of the wildlife in the wetland to make a catalog of the wildlife here. A leader from an environmental nonprofit mentored me. She was absolutely incredible. She often lobbied at the Capitol and spent a great deal of time giving me advice on next steps. I was able to connect with an environmental attorney who helped me understand the development rules that applied to this area. Number 2, creating public interest. My posts on Nextdoor that provided updates were top trending posts in the Twin Cities. Most received thousands of views. My highest trending post received almost 30,000 views. Number 3, reaching out to local politicians. We were actually heading into an election period, so there were 3 people running for city council. I reached out to all of them to ask them for their support. One came to my home and appeared very much in support of the neighbor's stance. Another was also in support. The third candidate was difficult for me to gauge because he talked in a lot of generalities, so I really didn't know where he stood in terms of this redevelopment. I reached out to my state representative and senator. I never heard back from my state senator, but I did hear back from the state representative who seemed to emphasize there wasn't anything that she could do because it was out of her lane. Number 4, information gathering from key stakeholders. I spoke with many agencies such as the DNR, Minnesota Pollution Control, the local watershed district, a local fire chief, etc. The DNR continued to tell me there was quote unquote no wetland impact and stopped returning my calls. So there was really no information that they could provide. That was an interesting response because the developer was requesting a wetland variance and there was buffer impact. Minnesota Pollution Control said they heard about me, quote unquote, and didn't want to get involved after I spoke to someone who was supposed to be a publicly facing figure. The local watershed district was initially helpful in answering my questions, but after a couple phone calls, they didn't seem like they wanted to talk to me anymore. Sometimes when I called other agencies to ask questions, I would receive a call back from the watershed district, even though I had not contacted them. I was told the agencies all work together to answer questions and route calls to each other, and they were apparently very familiar with me by now. A local fire marshal pointed out that there were not sprinklers in the parking garage and agreed if there was a fire in the garage, it would be difficult to fight because of limited access. I also discovered that Minnesota Fire Code did not incorporate considerations for electric vehicles, but those changes were coming soon and would not be reflected in this parking garage. To me, that seemed very negligent, especially knowing that this parking garage would house hundreds of electric vehicles. Number 5, marketing and branding. I created a website and social media sites for our group. This gave a face to the coalition and provided a creative way to engage neighbors while showing there were many people behind this movement, not just myself. Number 6, I wrote email updates to my neighbors in attempts to gain their support in writing to the mayor and planning department. Number 7, I personally visited every house on the wetland and spoke to homeowners about my concerns with the development. Number 8, I wrote a letter directly to the developer and pointed out how his value statements on his company website regarding sustainability and environmental conservation were in direct conflict with what he was proposing here. I never received a response. Right before the city council was supposed to hear the proposal, the developer pulled out, indicating He wanted to have more time to further incorporate neighborhood feedback. The mayor wondered out loud if it was because they needed 5 votes for the wetland variance and they would be short a member that evening. So the developer wouldn't have gotten the number of votes he needed and was told that ahead of time. That is why the meeting was rescheduled. It was disappointing to have it be rescheduled on such short notice because many neighbors were planning on coming. We were ready for the next city council meeting. The practical side of me felt discouraged because I guessed they would have only called the meeting if they had the number of votes they needed to pass the development. There were many neighbors in council chambers this time compared to only a few in previous meetings. My next door posts and personal visits to every household on the wetland were helpful. My neighbor was a state representative formerly. She came and spoke, as did many other concerned citizens from the community. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I would talk about and researched more about council members. I knew one member was a veterinarian and that they needed to take an oath to do no harm to animals. I focused a lot on the wetland habitat and the absence of an environmental assessment to appeal to her ethical responsibilities to her profession. I also highlighted that one agency I spoke with said that they would be very surprised if the wetland variance passed. So, really getting at each council member's confidence in their vote. If the council members understood that one of their community partners would be shocked if the variance passed, that might make the council member think again, because inherently these members care about their public reputations. Imposter syndrome is when a person doubts their skills and talents and feels like potentially a fraud in some way in regards to the position they're in. I imagine some council members may experience varying levels of imposter syndrome from time to time. I tapped into that psychological phenomenon by introducing quotes from other agencies that cast external doubt on the decision to push this development through.
Make your comments. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. My name is Jessica Yudchitz, and I live at 325 Towns Road. I understand this project is important to the city, which is why I've done research. I've spoken with the DNR, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, the Fire Department, an external fire protection expert, and environmental law attorneys. These are my top 5 concerns. Number 1, we requested examples of similar corporate developments that were granted wetland variances and the city could not provide us with any. Number 5, I keep hearing the term there is no wetland impact. Walser is needing to have a wetland and floodplain variance for the development because the wetland buffer will be impacted and this area is federally protected through the Wetland Conservation Act. The wetland buffer is important to habitat here because it filters rainwater runoff and helps keep surface waters clean. Studies by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency show that buffers are critical to protecting and restoring water quality. This massive parking ramp will destroy buffer area that is crucial to protecting this ecosystem. The trumpeter swan is North America's heaviest flying bird and one of its rarest. It embodies grace, beauty, unspoiled wilderness, and is the crown jewel of healthy wetlands. It's what's called an indicator species of healthy wetlands and waterways thriving in clean waters and high-quality habitats. They quote-unquote trumpet the cause for wetlands. That's from the Trumpeter Swan Society. Mr. Andrew Walser, may I remind you of your value statement on your website? Caring about the environment extends beyond our dealership. We're involved in community programs focused on preserving and protecting the environment. How do you think your potential buyers will feel knowing you requested a floodplain and wetland alteration variance which strips this wetland of its protection? Despite months of requests from neighbors, your final plan still does not include an environmental assessment. Council members, please vote no on this development and do not allow this to be tabled again. As a social worker, I have spent the majority of my career in intensive care units, providing therapy to patients who are dying or at great risk of death. The message from my patients is always the same: live a life that makes you proud, leave a legacy that makes you prouder. Mr. Mayor, city leaders, and council members, thank you for your time and service.
Thank you. Please do not, excuse me, but we do not applaud here.
The council member who was a veterinarian appeared to change her vote at the end and gave an official no vote, which seemed to shock the mayor and city staff. You could tell that staff were expecting that they would have enough votes and seemed speechless. They took a break behind closed doors, I am assuming to discuss how to move forward with the city attorney, as the wetland variance needed 5 votes, which they were now short of. Now, I mentioned that I had gotten to know the candidates that were vying for the empty seat. The member who had won previously pledged her support to our cause and even came to my house to show her support and see the proposed development firsthand. My strategy of getting the public interested in this cause worked. As I mentioned, I had thousands of views on each of my Nextdoor posts. I was confident this member would continue to support us. However, I underestimated something I refer to as inward versus outward mindset. A council member with an outward mindset has truly reached this stage of self-actualization, the highest level in Maslow's identified hierarchy of needs. This person would be able to appreciate the pressure from the city to adhere to their voting needs, but at the same time, understand they are in a dual role and their primary function is to serve the residents of the city they serve. This member would feel comfortable challenging the status quo. They would understand the motivations and agendas of others, evaluate conflicts of interest, and their dual role as a member. Above all, this member would act in an ethical manner and vote in accordance with this. A new council member with an inward mindset is likely going to be focused on proving that they are smart enough to be in this new role, even though insecurity is likely. They will be wanting to make new friends in the political world and establish good relationships with city leaders above all else. That is hard to do when you're asking difficult questions and challenging the status quo. A member with an inward mindset is truly interested in their own motivations, not the inherent good of the community. They will view their vote as a way to gain more power, more influence, and be accepted into their new role. I decided to schedule a meeting with our 2 new city council members to touch base with them before the vote. A few of my new environmentalist friends from the neighborhood joined me, as they had also worked closely with the city and wanted to help the cause. We met at a city-owned wellness center in the cafe area, ironically overlooking a beautiful wetland. I remember looking out into the waving grass and reciting the commitments the city had made on their website to preserving our community's wetland jewels. I found it incredibly sad that their actions did not reflect their promises and values proudly displayed on their city website. My council member came and seemed flustered. We were all chatting and going through a list of concerns with the development when she pulled out her notebook and essentially took over the meeting. She started questioning me about dates I had communicated with the city and telling me that I had not once ever tried to communicate my concerns to the city. She began with her list of interrogating questions. Now I was quickly seeing an inward mindset at play. I understood that she would clearly be voting for the development after saying for months that she had supported our position. I guessed it was pressure from the city, or maybe her desire to fit in, or maybe make a name for herself. Well, she was certainly making a name for herself with her constituents in this meeting. After a few minutes of interrogations, I began to cry and asked her to please stop. I reminded her that I invited her to this meeting and it was my meeting to facilitate, not hers. I explained that it felt like an attack, not a listening session with my council member, and that I was extremely disappointed. My confidence seemed to take her by surprise, and she seemed unprepared for what to do next. I gave both members some information I had put together, and the meeting was over. I felt sad for this new council member. Later in the month, the new city council heard the proposal again with minimal changes. We were given barely any notice to attend the meeting. Many neighbors received their postcards on Thursday and Friday for the meeting that was to take place on Monday. That was in clear violation of their policy. I explained to the city that a neighbor with a disability needed at least 48 hours to call Metro Mobility so that he could attend. He lived on the wetland. I was told he could participate over the phone and that he didn't have to come in person. I understood that they had the votes in place to pass the redevelopment, and at this point, there was little I could do besides pursuing litigation. I did attend the city council meeting and spoke. This time, it was not to persuade the members to vote against the project. I knew that was not going to happen at this point. I did want them to truly understand the gravity of a decision in which they are voting for a development that is clearly in opposition to the city's own ordinances. That choice to me meant not being on the side of the people, but choosing their own agenda, their own allegiances, instead of doing the right thing. I wanted them to feel bad for this decision, to think about the legacy they are leaving for themselves, their family. Perhaps that was spiteful, but I felt it would also give me closure and remind city council members that they should not be here for self-serving reasons. Many of the council members were Democrats and had campaign websites that emphasized their quote unquote commitment to protecting the environment, specifically wetlands in our community. Believe me, I did point out this cognitive dissonance to them several times throughout the process. Also at this last city council meeting, the developer brought in a wetland scientist who said that the development would not impact wildlife in any way. When asked if he was aware of any noise pollution studies and how construction might negatively impact wildlife, he said he was not aware of any. I did a quick search on Google Scholar sitting in the audience and scrolled through several studies.
Other comments from members of the audience? Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members, and city staff. My name is Jessica Yudchitz. I live at 325 Towns Road. I would ask you to reflect on what the words leadership and integrity mean to you. Mr. Mayor, at the December 4th City Council meeting, you said, quote, if the ramp were fully enclosed, it might be more visually appealing. But again, that's dealing with view and the things that are beyond the purview of the council, end quote. At an earlier city council meeting, you described the concerns of residents as simply being about, quote, air rights. I am curious if you have read the section in the I-394 district ordinances entitled Design Standards. It reads, the city has determined the development located in the planned I-394 district requires a high degree of design quality. The high visibility of properties from the interstate frontage and the proximity of development sites to single-family residential neighborhoods dictate sensitive design considerations. This section is intended to serve the public interest, maintain and enhance property values, and mitigate the impacts between adjacent land uses of different intensity through appropriate design standards. So if this narrative sets the tone for the spirit of the code, I am at a loss for how neighborhood concerns are dismissed when the language here is very clear. Single-family residential neighborhoods and their property values are specifically outlined here. You cannot say our concerns about views and property values are unfounded when these same considerations were described in the narrative explaining the reason for the design standards in this area. With this being said, Mr. Mayor, I would like to know if you still believe our property values and our views are, quote, beyond the purview of this council. In a recent article entitled, quote, How Does Construction Affect Wildlife from Building and Construction magazine, the reader is educated as to the severe disturbances construction can have on wildlife. Quote, the loud and persistent noise from construction machinery, equipment, and activities can disrupt the natural behavior and communication patterns of animals. This disturbance can lead to stress, altered feeding patterns, reduced reproductive success, and even abandonment of habitats. So what are the key takeaways from this article? Construction activities have a significant negative impact on wildlife, including air and water pollution, migration interruption, and threats to many species. Mitigation measures such as environmental impact assessments, habitat prevention, noise reduction, collaboration with conservation agencies are crucial. Additionally, establishing buffer zones around sensitive habitats can help minimize the direct impact of construction noise on wildlife. So in conclusion, let's talk about something, or in this case, someone, who can unite us. Hometown hero Joe Mauer. He's a 6-time All-Star 3 American League batting champ, 2009 American League Most Valuable Player, and now soon to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. I went to Cretin-Derham Hall with Joe. He's a great guy, great family, incredible leader. In 2001, he noticed a student who was eating lunch by himself, Mike, a junior who was a transfer student and struggling to make friends. He was also visually impaired. Mike and Joe had class before lunch, so Joe thought he would walk with him to the cafeteria and invite him to eat lunch at his table, the cool table. Well, that tradition lasted the entire year, and Mike was soon making many friends and feeling very included in the social dynamics at his new school. This friendship changed many lives, including mine, as I watched Joe walk Mike to class, both with wide smiles, chatting about sports stats. I'm convinced that incredible level of integrity and leadership is one of the reasons he's headed to the Hall of Fame. Council members, please do not vote for this development proposal. An expert on your own council summarized in the December 4th council meeting, the site is too small to comply with I-394 overlay district landscaping ordinances and to house this parking ramp. Mr. Mayor, city council members, and city leaders, please don't let this tale end with the failure of local government and the failure of corporate responsibility. Let's ask ourselves an important question: what would Joe Mauer do? Thank you all for your time, integrity, and leadership.
Thank you, Ms. Yudchitz. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Is there anyone? So I'll tell you what, we're running a little late here, so I'm going to ask people, if you want to speak, line up so that we keep things moving, so we don't have people looking across the room and say, are you going to speak? Are you going to speak? Line up, and then when we don't have everybody in line, we know we're done. So we want to try and move things along. So please line up please say your name and address, and we'll listen to what you have to say. But if there's nobody behind you, we'll end the public part of this. So thank you.
Sounds good. Dan Yudchitz here, 325 Towns Road. Great to see everyone here again and some new faces. There's a lot of great content in the packet, including Brad Sheppy's letter, which I hope everyone has had a good chance to read and review. We've had a pretty exhaustive conversation today about the history of this project. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but there are some key aspects of this that I think need to be brought up again for consideration. So the large parking lot that was originally submitted was not allowed because the zoning code only allows for one parking space per 200 square feet of building. So let's talk about intent here. This was intended to end the suburban trend of huge parking lots with small buildings. This is something I don't think any of us here want, so good thing. So when Walzer proposed a 4-story parking ramp that was about 181,000 square feet, that was basically, an enclosed building of this size, or if it was enclosed like BMW, it would be too large to conform with the floor area ratio requirements for this site. So we found out at last meeting, it was clarified that parking ramps are not considered in floor area ratio calculations. So if we think about the intent of this code, the intent of that code was not to have large buildings on small sites, on sites that are too small. Again, something that I think we can all relate to. But the fact that a parking ramp, which in fact is not even enclosed, because sometimes I hear this referred to as an enclosed parking ramp. It's not an enclosed parking ramp. BMW is an enclosed parking ramp. This is an open structure. It's not enclosed. So anyway, I think that's a key distinction that I would like to get some clarification on. So in any case, if this was built as a building like BMW, it would exceed the allowable floor area ratio. So you can screen a parking lot with trees and a berm. We all know that can be done. Can you screen a parking lot that's elevated in the sky, that's not a building? It's going to take a heck of a lot more than trees and a little berm. So this is a complicated project. It needs a conditional use permit. It needs variances, which is why we're here today, as was noted earlier. What this means is that you as the council have discretion. You have discretion to say, this is the type of project that we want built in these sorts of situations. A project like this, to be successful, takes a civil, collaborative, inclusive discussion and engagement. I don't know that we've had that. And it's going to take that to come up with a favorable outcome for neighbors, for Walzer, and for wildlife. So again, I just encourage everyone here to ask themselves if an open air 3-story parking ramp that is exposed on many sides, built to the very extents of the allowable buffers, that doesn't allow for screening within those buffers, is that the type of development that we want to encourage here in Minnetonka going forward? I think that's the question here. So thank you all for your time. Appreciate everyone's time and commitment to coming to a right solution to this.
Thank you for your comments. Good evening. Welcome.
Hi.
So in conclusion, I believe what happened here is that the city tried to push through this development as quickly as possible without getting this on the public radar. They didn't anticipate someone would be vocal or effective at community organizing. They didn't think anyone would take the time to read the city ordinances and work with an attorney and coalition of other experts to prove how this redevelopment was actually against city ordinances. They constantly tried to suppress public engagement by not offering any in-person listening sessions for this development proposal, as they had done with many other developments, not providing appropriate notice time for meetings, and not allowing a neighbor with a disability to participate in his preferred way. They wanted this development and told the developer they needed to build a large parking garage because that meant more money for the city. The compromise would have been that the developer would build a surface level parking lot and would have been granted a variance for this. The neighbors and the developer would have been okay with this. The city is the one who did not compromise. Instead, they facilitated a redevelopment process that was clearly not in accordance with their own ordinances, and when called out on that, they continued to push it through. I learned that local politics is a messy arena dominated by personal ambitions, internal motivations, and that more leaders are needed with outward mindsets, not inward mindsets. Although my victories were small, they felt mighty in the moment. One story was taken off the parking garage. It was outfitted with sprinklers after I fought for this. We recommended lighting that would be less intrusive to wildlife. There were many positive experiences I take from this experience also. I met many new friends who are local environmentalists and some who are nationally recognized for their efforts. I became connected to a local nonprofit who champions clear water and wetland conservation, and now I sit on their board. A local photographer is helping us take professional photos of the wildlife here to complete a formal wildlife catalog. Social workers have the knowledge and skills to be great coalition builders and community organizers. We truly have a unique lens to view the world, and our commitment and obligation to promote social and environmental justice. The biggest takeaways to share would be: number one, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you in areas you are not familiar with. An example in this story was in regards to the city codes and ordinances. Number two, build a coalition of people who share common values and are willing to get involved. Number three, influence public opinion. Use Nextdoor to post and get followers. Use Canva and other professional design tools to help brand your message. Number four, realize there will always be politics that are corrupt. Number five, understand inward versus outward mindset concepts and how this guides voting decisions. Number six, these situations can be very contentious and conflict prone. Try to always keep it professional. Number seven, provide closure and thank those who supported you. We had a neighborhood party at the American Legion in our neighborhood for Taco Tuesday, and we celebrated our advocacy efforts. As the great Martin Luther King Jr. said, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. As Margaret Wheatley, an American writer, described, there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Government collusion, corruption, and intimidation is certainly not the end to this wetland tale. I firmly believe the trumpeter swans will have the final say. Thank you for watching.